Friends, it might not be surprising to learn that the origin of all bad answers is the same origin as all things that are bad. Mankind's lapse, his fall into sin in Genesis. The first bad answers that we ever encounter right there. And so we begin with this reality of the fall. We all have a father, one father, human and in the flesh. His name was Adam. And you guys know the story. God gave him and his wife Eve an explicit command to not eat from the fruit of this forbidden tree. They do so upon being prompted by the serpent, our great enemy, the devil. And God, shortly after that episode, begins asking Adam difficult questions. And so we have the origin of bad answers. Now, the most basic bad answers are answers that are overt lies in one way or another. In fact, Adam's answer to the Lord when he began asking questions wasn't an overt lie. It was a matter of blame shifting, which is a more subtle sort of lying. We read that God said, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree of which I commanded you not to eat?" And what does Adam say? It says, the man said, "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me from the tree and I ate." This is something very different than a straight answer. God said, "Did you eat?" He could have simply said, "Yes, I did, Lord," and it might have been the beginning of a word of repentance. But it wasn't. This information that he includes in his answers is like a shield intervening but not relevant truths at all. See, God commanded Adam directly not to eat from the tree, and he brings up the woman, and not only the woman, but the woman he mentions, whom you made. This is the beginning of blame shifting, where we attempt to guard ourselves by imputing our guilt to another. There's something of a half-truth, therefore. The main point of his answer is obscured by irrelevant data. And any parent in the room, and anyone who's ever been a child, well, that's all of us, knows that we have engaged in just these sorts of activities and seen others do the same. But see, things get worse. Sin doesn't just remain in this place where we blame shift in giving bad answers. They birth outright lies in the very next chapter. When Cain strikes his brother Abel, and God then again goes and asks questions to Cain, as he did his father Adam. And he says, "Where's your brother?" And Cain outrightly lies. He doesn't just outrightly lie. He says, "I don't know." And then he says, "Am I my brother's keeper?" and calls into question the whole job of guardianship he's supposed to have over another. Blame shifting, outright lies. Most of us are prepared to recognize and to admit that these sorts of things constitute bad answers. What's frightening is that there are more insidious lies, more subtle, that can actually be operative in answers that in our mind we tell ourselves are true or good, but are in fact deceptive. I'm going to talk about these more subtle dangers and how we might answer a good question from a friend. And I hope we can all be supremely introspective as we do this. Here's the first error I want to set before you. One grave error that plagues our society and necessarily our church is the idea that an honest or authentic answer equals unbounded expression of how I feel. You might receive the question, "How are you doing?" You might even say that in passing. It's actually kind of a common greeting, "How are you?" right? How many people have ever asked that question and had someone respond very literally and even indignantly? Like you say, "How are you doing?" And you're like, "Not great, actually." Anyone ever done that to you? Maybe you've done it? Yeah? It's kind of this affront on the whole system of greeting that is all fake and mean, not really intended for anybody's good. all just mentioned in passing, a brief defense of politeness. All of the New Testament epistles begin and even sometimes end with commands to greet one another with grace and peace. In fact, there is some truth to the idea that your neighbor ought to expect a friendly greeting from you and extend one, and isn't all fake. But you guys get the point. You can answer a question in a way that you say to yourself, I'm just being honest, when in fact, that's a lie. You're not just being honest. When you answer the question, how did you enjoy our date? And you say, I actually hated dinner. Someone says, how are you enjoying yourself at this event? And someone says, I never liked doing this activity. When someone asks the question, what's up? And they say, I'm actually just really angry at you, and thus begins a tirade, you might tell yourself that you're just being honest, and that's not true. When we simply allow our mouths to flow forth speech impassioned by our feelings without constraint, in addition to stating something true, you are being inconsiderate, possibly petty, possibly grumbling, possibly gossiping. All things which don't comport with a Christian ethic. How many of our answers, how many of the questions we hear do we take as an opportunity to be petty and to share what's the worst and most base about us? To be petty is to be small in relationship to something. It's to be small in a way that we are overcome by inconsequential matters that ought to not be that big of a deal, but it's like we're a little miniature person in relation to them, and we cannot handle these matters as anything but huge impediments to our happiness. See, when we answer with pure emotion, we are actually answering, no matter how true our emotion is at that moment, we're answering with a lie to other people that my present and overwhelming emotion best represents me. And it almost never does. In many respects, a purely emotive answer is a dishonest answer, because we're all more than our present feelings. Ecclesiastes 7:3 puts it this way: when the face is sad, the heart may be happy. You can have an underlying joy even when you're really angry in the moment, really sad in the moment. And you could just as well say those who appear happy in the moment, like so many in the world, may actually have an underlying misery. This is why answering questions on the basis of our feelings, or even taking an invitation to do so, is something very literal, is actually at the heart of what it means to answer badly. There's a lie to other people when we communicate that my overwhelming feeling about the moment or this part of my life overshadows everything else, any joy that might underlie it. How does this come to bear on the questions that you might have when it comes to going to a small group or even having a dinner with one another or a lunch? It's very simple. I'll give you an example. Someone says, how did you like the sermon? You might reply, I hated it. When in fact, maybe there was just one point in it that you hated. And that's something different. Simply responding out of emotion is never advised to us in the Bible. In fact, it's described as definitive of the fool. Proverbs 12:16, a fool's anger is known at once, but a prudent man conceals dishonor. Proverbs 12:18, there is one who speaks rashly like the thrust of a sword, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. Proverbs 15:1-4 has a lot to say about harsh words. A harsh word stirs up anger, spouts folly, crushes the spirit. Think about this, friends. If somebody asks you the question, how are you doing? And you take it as an open invitation to let the floodgates of your worst emotions flow out without reservation. What happens if that interlocutor takes your reply as a gesture inviting them to do the same, perhaps in the opposite direction, to express their indignance toward you without reserve? What's going to happen? You're going to have a blow up, maybe one that you can't repair. You know, if you tell someone what your greatest frustrations are in reply to the question, how are you doing? I hate X, Y, or Z. You might get the response, well, I hate you for telling me. And something bad erupts. See, once you get into this habit of answering questions with your fleeting, momentary feelings as the biggest truth in the room, how do you ever determine who's right? Except that the person who is loudest and best at pouring out their heart, their truth is bigger and more relevant and more meaningful. It's a frightening way to communicate. See, one of the dangers of unbridled answers to questions, one danger is that it justifiably invites people to keep their distance from you. It does. Proverbs 17:12 says, let a man meet a bear robbed of her cubs rather than a fool in his folly. You don't want to meet a bear robbed of her cubs. You don't even want to try to make friends with a bear robbed of her cubs. Danger. Jesus himself puts it this way, do not give what is holy to dogs. He's talking about his whole entire ministry and message. And do not throw your pearls before swine, or they will trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. You would be naive to attempt to have deep intimacy with a person who has a track record of saying whatever violent thing comes to their mind like a thrust of a sword. And this is counterintuitive because I think a lot of people just presume that as Christians we have an ethic of pure niceness to anyone and everyone, but we also have an ethic where we're called to guard our hearts. This is a frightening thing because if you are prone to answering questions by letting your mouth flow forth whatever you feel, thoughtful, godly people will justifiably keep a distance from you. They'd be obeying Jesus in the Proverbs to do so. And the frightening thing is once you start doing that, you have now self-selected your peer group as a peer group of other people who answer questions with their deepest, unbridled emotions. And those are the people you're now surrounded with in a community that is inherently dangerous to everyone in it. In fact, you end up with a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you take it as an invitation to say whatever you feel when you're asked questions, when you think that's authentic, when you think that, what you end up doing is you'll end up in a self-fulfilling prophecy where no one cares about me. You'll say that to yourself. And in fact, wise people are keeping a distance from you, and you find yourself alone. These are basic biblical principles and truths, and the macro danger of it all is maybe even believing that your feelings are the truest thing about you. And you'd be in exactly the place, this dangerous cage that the world is in. I might even have this sense that if I have a big feeling, then I need to do justice to it. I need to give expression to it. But I want you to think about what you're actually saying. When you say, I need to do justice to my feelings, you're treating them as something that must be paid a price. You must pay them their due. And the next thing you know, you are enslaved to your feelings as these things that you must respect ultimately and absolutely. What a frightening thing that would be. Now, I know what some people are thinking right now. Maybe this is the point of the sermon that you'll talk about hating at small group, but many of you are thinking, my goodness, Brant, what's the deal? It sounds like you're saying I should never share my heart. It sounds like you're saying I should just completely deny any feeling I've ever had, especially if it's bad or upsetting to other people. That's what I heard. No, in fact, I'm advising a better way. I'm telling you that before you answer any question about how you feel about something, people have a right to expect that you have done some work weighing those feelings against biblical truth and asking if they're legitimate. People have a right to expect that from you. Not every feeling is valid. Some of them are a mark of bad character. Some of them are a mark of pettiness. Some of them need to be parted with. One of the important ways that we can do this, and this is profoundly important for us all. No matter what feeling we have of indignance or elation, we need to recognize this. More significant than any evil committed against any one of us are the evils we've committed against our Creator. We have to carry around with that understanding. It puts everything in its proper place. Moreover, more significant than any evil committed against us is the grace of God towards us. Those 2 points are meant to regulate the unbridled emotions of any Christian person. Second thing I would say when it comes to our biggest feelings is that we had better be in the practice of more thoroughly pouring them out to God than to any man. Might I suggest that if you feel overwhelmingly burdened by any circumstance, other person's behaviors, situation at work, you need to be in the practice of pouring out your heart to God in speech and in prayer more thoroughly than to any man. Otherwise, guess what? You will begin to treat men, your neighbor, as if they even could or should be able to give you a comfort that only God can. The Psalms teach us that human emotion is not evil. David pours out his heart, but guess what? Those Psalms were not primarily written to you or any other contemporary of David. Who are they written to? They're written to God. There is something fundamentally regulating to our hearts and emotions when we make God the one who is the primary recipient of our laments, our imprecations, and our burdens. Moreover, the Psalms teach us that almost every single word of sorrow ends with words of confidence. If you read the Psalms, you will hear some big feelings and big emotions, but the last words on David's lips are almost always, in all but 3 Psalms, words of confidence in God's provision to heal, to protect, and to provide for. A better way, therefore, a better way to share your feelings is as a person who has reflected on them, shared them with the Lord, and had them regulated in some meaningful degree. This means maybe when you talk about the sermon, you say it with a little bit more reserve. I hated it when I first heard point 3 in the sermon. But on reflection, it's true and qualified by point 4. And it even revealed that my skin is pretty thin when it comes to topics of X. That would be a better answer. But the first error we'll move on from, if you're taking notes, it was the error of assuming that honesty means unbounded expression of how I feel. But there's another error. It is the error of full disclosure in our answers. Somebody might say, tell me about yourself. Or tell me what you think about X. And you take that as an open door to tell them everything. In addition to perhaps being criminally long-winded, this problem of too much information is something we must be keenly aware of. Once again, you might tell yourself when you let forth the floodgate of the entire story, of all the information you know on one given topic. You might tell yourself you're just being honest. But you're not. You're being something more, and you're being false in a certain respect. You're believing a lie and asking others to believe lies too. The first lie that you're telling yourself and you're telling others. When upon first meet, they ask you to tell you about yourself. The first lie that you're telling yourself and others is that people can handle the full disclosure of who I am, where I'm from, and what I've experienced. The second lie you're telling yourself is that all people, or even all Christians, can be trusted with the full disclosure of the facts of my story and my heart. How many of you have fallen into this error? Too quickly, you assume that some fellowship or community, too quickly, you assume that they can be trusted with your heart and all your information. Proverbs 4:23 says to watch over your heart with all diligence, for from it flow the springs of life. You've got to guard this thing. In the air of disclosing too much, it reflects the idea that you don't have a sense of a need to guard your heart. The reality, friends, is you might say to yourselves, well, I expected when I walked into this fellowship that everyone there was a Christian and I could just trust them indiscriminately with all my secrets and information. But guess what? Some Christians are false brothers. Some Christians are immature. Some of them are battling their own sins, and being inconsiderate or selfish is one of them. There is no sign on the door that says everyone here is supremely mature. Even ask yourselves if you could say that about your own ability to befriend another. I'll note that you did not learn this business of full disclosure from Jesus. You definitely didn't learn it from him. Jesus is very often secretive in his ministry on earth. In fact, it is entirely noticeable to any reader, just as it was entirely noticeable to all of the disciples, that Jesus had layers and levels of friendship with different people. And he disclosed more to some than to others. Jesus had around him a vast group of disciples. Of that vast group of disciples, he had 70 in particular who he empowered uniquely. Beyond that, he had an inner core of 12 disciples, and beyond that, he had a special group of 3, Peter, James, and John, who got to see more than the rest. And beyond that, he had a disciple who's called the disciple whom Jesus loved. No other disciples called that. His name was John. There were layers of disclosure. You know, for some of us, it's amazing that Jesus in his ministry didn't show up on the scene day one and simply declare, I'm the eternal Son of God. I'm also called the Logos. The whole Bible is written about me. I've been sent to atone for sins by my death on the cross. Want to see me transfigured? It doesn't happen. That just isn't how it works. And many of us go into answering questions as if it's an invitation to full disclosure. And my goodness, is there a danger when we do that? Too many authentic Christians lament how they've been chewed up and spit out by this or that Christian church or organization, and never do they consider that maybe I am in part culpable for this. Because I believed lies about myself and how easy I am to handle in all my depth and breadth, and lies about others. At this point, some people are saying, well, what I'm hearing, Brant, is that I should never share the details of my story or my life that are difficult to handle. I should just clam up. That's what I'm taking from the sermon. It's not what we're saying. What we're saying is there's a better way. There's a better way, and that better way means having answers that gradually introduce ourselves to other people. What this means is that if you want to have real deep friendship with people, you're going to have to put some work into that relationship to make sure that it's wise to disclose greater depths of yourself in it. Proverbs 14:15 says this, the naive believe everything, but the sensible man considers his steps. There are steps to deeper relationship. A sensible man considers, what step are we at in this relationship? This is going to be profoundly important for everyone in this room in the most practical of ways. Young men, if a lady ever asks you, how did you enjoy our date? No matter how well that first date went, don't respond, I'm in love with you. That will be your last date, men. There won't be another one. There are levels and steps toward meaningful relationship, and we would all be naive to suppose that there shouldn't be. I, as a minister, will often meet people who maybe even on their first visit to our church says, oh my goodness, I love your church. I can tell it's not like all the other churches. This is the greatest church. And I'm just sitting there thinking, man, wait until you actually meet some of us. I don't even feel that way about our church or myself. There is a naivety that we can bring to things and be that man who believes everything. The challenge, however, is that some of us are in situations of crisis where I need to share my situation now. I have to engage in something more like full disclosure because I'm in a crisis. If you find yourself in that sort of a place, guess what would be wise? Don't go into your small group and give them the TMI answer. Don't even share that with the person in the church with whom you find yourself having the greatest imaginable affinity, but only 2 weeks young. That's when you want to start with ordained leaders and people in the leadership of a church. Why do I say that? It's not because there's some supernatural grace that we have that others don't, but there's something wise about that. You're talking about people who've managed to carry on in a community for multiple years. Every one of our ordained leaders has committed to at least 5-year terms of service. There are people who have shown a manifest ability to share others' secrets without sharing them at full disclosure as well, beyond your desire. And that's one of the reasons why we have a church with ordained leaders. It's evident, hopefully, that these leaders can sustain long-term friendships without compromising them. Matthew 7:20 says that you will recognize them by their fruits. I will tell you this, friends. Many of you are just visiting. I know that. As you go about searching for a church to call your own, take very seriously the ability or lack thereof of leaders to sustain long-term friendships. I promise you, no church will rise above the ability of its leaders to have long-term friendships. It's just not going to be a regular reality in the culture. What this means is if you end up in some church where there is profound gifting that is manifest, but no ability to carry on in long-term relationship, it should give you pause. If you don't have the ability to see past smoke and mirrors to things that matter, you are in part culpable if you find yourself in a place where you feel all alone with no deep relationship. Matthew 7:20, you will recognize them by their fruits. Not just by their gifting, friends. This leads us to the third error in terms of a bad answer. And we've always said the better way. You want to first consider your emotions, have worked on them. That's a better answer than letting them flood forth. You want to expect levels of disclosure rather than TMI. But here's the third error. It's when your every answer is about that one thing. That one thing. It could be your one and only sin. It could be your one and only burden. It could be your one and only interest. And somehow, no matter what somebody asks you, it goes back to that thing. Practically, I'll have you know this is really annoying. Okay? You can just put that in the basket of things that that is undesirable. But furthermore, it contains a secret lie. I'll tell you something that is altogether prominent when you're actually discussing with someone. It may be one of those deeper level conversations discussing real battles with sin. we are all inclined to have that one sin that we're struggling with. For addicts, it might be addiction. For those who are dealing with pornography, it is that one sin that always comes up. And then next thing you know, that one sin is the sole criterion that people have for success or failure in their sanctification. You know, this is dangerous not only to those with whom we are talking, but it's dangerous for our own psyche if we've just got one sin. We've got to be able to consider that maybe we are dealing on a regular basis with addiction. But part of our answer as to how we are doing, maybe if we're hot in the struggle with addiction, has got to be, you know what? I've really been getting down when it comes to my addiction. But here's the thing. I have made it to addicts meetings twice a week for 6 months. And guess what? Even if you're still burdened by addiction, you actually got something to celebrate called self-discipline that you showed up to a meeting twice a week for 6 months. There's something more to share. That is a more meaningful answer. And there's something to be celebrated even as there is an issue to be dealt with. Same is true as to how you're doing and your positive answers. For some of us, the one criterion for how we're doing is that work's going well, or my golf game is great, or family seems just fine. We're all more complex than that. We're all more complex than that. We have more to share. It's very important we understand that. Because when we don't, people fall into the error of assuming that the best and most rich communities are the communities that will just talk to me about nothing at all but the one thing. Scott Hedgecock, he is on the board of an organization for Christian business leaders. And one time, Scott invited me out to go to this business leaders meeting in Bellevue. All these guys rubbing elbows who are killing it in business and doing great. And as I was talking with these guys, it's a great organization, but I talked with one of them. It's like, he seemed to really love the Lord. And I was like, yeah, well, what church do you go to? He goes, church, this is my church. The Christian business leaders meeting that meets once a month in Bellevue is your church? Wow. I assume that's because you like one set of questions and like one set of answers, and that's the one big thing. And people do this in a myriad of ways. There's a church called Triple X Church. As you might imagine, the aim is to help people with pornography addictions, and that is commendable in itself. But guess what? No church has just one sin to deal with. And we actually do harm to the entire Christian life when we treat it like it is. Because here's the thing, you can be killing it in business and you can be kicking your bad habits, all the while growing in your self-absorption, all the while lacking empathy with people who have successes or problems that are different from yours. Real churches and real answers require of us more than talk about the one thing. It's amazing to me, but very often, we're a Reformed church naturally, being Presbyterian. But there are people who, when asked the question, is it a good church? They go, yeah, for sure, it's Reformed. Of course. I've had people very keen to that criterion for a good church and then come to me and say, but I've noticed nobody there manifests joy about anything. They really seem like a joyless place. There are other things that are important, friends. The better way for all of us is to be students of the big picture. We have to be students of the big picture first before our answers are going to be rich. Jesus, for example, says to the Pharisees, "Woe to you, Pharisees, for you pay tithe of mint and rue and every kind of garden herb, and yet disregard justice and the love of God. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others." He says, there are a bunch of things. Way to go, tithing. But there are other things to consider. Hopefully, when you come to church, you're forced to consider some of those other things. Hopefully, you're developing the habit of having answers that are deeper than the one thing. Just the same, Psalm 105 verse 2 says, sing to him, sing praises of all his wonders, glory in his holy name. It has this command to be a student of all God's wonderful things. That is the prerequisite to a good answer. That's the better way. But now I'm going to turn to my one positive admonition, not just errors, but the deepest and most profound positive admonition for how to become good at answering questions and how to be a real friend. And it begins with this. You've got to take this in. Everyone here, all of you who believed in Jesus Christ, you have a secret. You have a secret. A secret that should be shared in every single answer you give to every meaningful question. Now, to expound this secret, I just want you to think for a moment about Jesus. How many people, when reading the Gospels, you read Jesus' answers to questions, and they always seem like the best answer? Like he just nailed it. Drove it home. I will tell you, Jesus, who is stellar at answering questions, with answers that were so deep, sometimes so brilliant and pithy, other times full sermons, and sometimes so stimulating, provocative, and otherworldly that people gasped at his answers. It all flowed from a secret that he had. The greatest New Testament scholars have recognized this thing called the messianic secret. And here's what it was. In every question Jesus answered, he answers like a man who is from another world, and believe it or not, a man from another time. Yeah, I'm talking about time travel. Let me explain what I mean. Jesus, even while he walked on this earth, in his deity, was still in heaven, very literally. Even while Jesus was on earth, he was still in heaven, and he spoke with heavenly perspective and an electrifying conviction that accompanied it. You might ask, why does he often silence people from saying that he is the Son of God? It's because he wants people to meditate on what his acts and deeds mean before they even share them. He wants others to be challenged by his presence face to face before they've heard about him. As Jesus puts the matter, believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me. It is a declaration that even now I'm somewhere else. But this secret is even more wild when you consider the matter of time. See, Jesus came announcing the presence of the kingdom of heaven. In Jewish thought, there was supposed to be a never-ending kingdom marked by nothing but happiness, victory over sin and every enemy, but it was to come in the future. And Jesus kept saying, the kingdom of God is here because I'm here. The age to come is here because I'm here. Jesus goes around healing, casting out demons, commanding the elements with sovereign authority, and he does this to make it clear that he is bringing eternity into time, because that's what Isaiah says eternity is going to look like. Jesus walked around as a man on the other side of the last judgment, already victorious, already justified. When you read the Gospels in light of the fact that Jesus is the man on the other side of the future judgment, Jesus is the man who's always also in heaven, it makes all of his answers make more sense. When Jesus is asked the question, which is the greatest commandment? Imagine him answering that as a man from the future, already in eternity, and a man in heaven, and it makes a lot more sense. Jesus says it's obvious what the greatest commandment is. It's to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And how do I know that? Because if you could see things like I do, I'm standing in eternity right now watching all men worship the Father continually, without cessation, without exhaustion, with all that they are. And they're doing it in unison with love and appreciation for one another that never wanes. If you could see what I see, you'd know the answer. Obviously, the fourth commandment about worshiping one day in seven isn't the greatest, because they're going to worship every day at all times. Obviously, it's not thou shalt not steal, because where I'm standing, all men own everything. They even own one another, and not in equal parts like a communist utopia, but totally and completely. There's no stealing going on where everyone owns everything. When you understand Jesus' perspective, his secret, seventh commandment would make no sense. He can already see heaven and eternity where they neither marry nor are given in marriage. When Jesus questions, why don't your disciples fast? He answers, because the bridegroom is present. He answers as if a man in that eternal celebration. And his answer is along the lines of, are you crazy? Where the kingdom of heaven is and where the king is, where eternity is, there's no fasting. There's just feasting. He answers as a man with a secret. In fact, friends, there's a time when a woman who is a sinner, probably a prostitute, is washing his feet with her hair. And the Pharisees say in their hearts, if only he knew, as if a rhetorical question, what type of woman this is. But when you understand Jesus' perspective, that he is already in eternity, he can already see that woman totally redeemed. He says, oh no, I know just what type of woman this is. She is an eternal, spotless daughter of God. But so that you may know, daughter, he says, your sins are forgiven. Your faith in me has saved you forever. And here's how I know. I already see you there, and I'll see you again soon. This is Jesus' secret. And it made every answer wonderful. Guess what? You have a secret. And it's just as wonderful. If you believed in Jesus Christ, you belong to another heavenly place, and you are a citizen of another time, a future time on the other side of the judgment, where all your questions are answered. Jesus says it this way, as you sent me into the world, he says to his Father, I also have sent them into the world. But Jesus was sent from heaven. Many of you will say, I've never been to heaven. Let me tell you something. The entire point of this doctrine of justification by faith alone is that you are so forgiven that your life right now is hidden with God in Christ, says Colossians 3:4. You're already a citizen of heaven. You are so forgiven that you are already on the other side of the judgment. For you, eternity has begun. And that secret, when you believe it, when you meditate on it, it changes every answer you will ever have. Just do a thought experiment with me for just a moment. Imagine you, with all your wherewithal now, could go back in time and relive high school. And at the end of every night at high school, you came back to these people right here and shared about your day. Now, most of us in high school had all sorts of insecurities that now seem laughable, don't they, right? Imagine what you would be like if you went back with your wherewithal now, your total lack of concern or care for all of these sorts of social dynamics that got you down back then. It would be sort of a game, sort of a joke in a certain respect. You would be a different person in that high schooler's body. You would even feel a little bit invincible. Like literally nothing here can change the reality and the perspective of what I now have as an adult. You live and act as if you were above the fray. I think we all know that. What if you could look at the present right now as if you had already conquered every problem? It would change everything. Every answer about how your week went, every answer about what's getting you down. And that's what the Bible says when it says we are more than conquerors. Some of you are so wrapped up in the moment. You're so wrapped up in politics. You're so wrapped up in things going on in this world that you have no sense of your secret that you've already conquered. You say it on the theology exam, but it doesn't come out in any answer you give. You lack that perspective. And I do too, friends. If you were to ask me how did my week go last week, what comes to mind is I actually had a family member who doesn't really share our worldview. In fact, is hostile to it in many ways. And believe it or not, she called and asked for some advice. I'll be honest with you, I kind of dreaded going into that conversation. I knew I might have someone who's really hostile to what I say. And a lot of you guys are thinking, Brant, you share the faith all the time. It must have been easy for you. No, I really didn't want to do it. And with my perspective, to take the perspective for a moment from eternity, I'm already a conqueror. There's something laughable about being afraid to have that conversation. I ended up having it. It was amazing. It was like an hour long, and I shared the depths and the breadths of the Christian worldview. It was wonderful. You've got to look back on your life from eternity now. There was a time when I was younger where it just felt so cool to be a worker. I don't know if you ever had this feeling, but my first waiter job at the spaghetti factory, I had a $600 used 1982 Tercel. And there's just something amazing about being able to drive to work, make enough money to do the things I wanted when I was 19 years old, and go back and keep doing the same thing. It just felt cool, like I was part of this thing. Be self-sufficient, support myself, be part of the economy. What if you could look at your work right now with heavenly perspective and see how your vocation upholds the very structure of society? It's part of this thing, and it's a society where Christ's redemption is going forth and being applied by the Holy Spirit to the elect. What if you could look at your job in that light? Moms, what if you could look from eternity and say, I'm raising and educating and feeding and loving these eternal souls worshiping around the throne? In eternity, it would obviously all be worth it. What if you could even look at your life more thoughtfully and see the hand of God running through everything, like you're going to be able to see with such clarity in eternity? In everything, little things. I think about the first thing I bought when I worked at the spaghetti factory. I bought with $40 the complete works of Plato. This book has followed me through the years. This book has followed me through the years. It was a fascinating instrument that God used to hone my ability to see how unbelieving thought has this wonderful amalgamation of brilliance and folly all at once. This book followed me to my engagement over Christmas. We got married in January. Over Christmas time, we went down to Heather's family, and I remember I was reading the complete works of Plato. I never got out of my pajamas that day, and late in the evening, Heather had some errands to run, and I was sitting in the rec room, and I remember Heather's mom came in, and she told me how pleased she was to have her daughter marrying a man like me. And that was impressive because a guy in his pajamas reading Plato is just not usually what mom is looking for. That guy might never get out of pajamas. I remember the early years of our church plant going, I can't change a bunch of things. But I said, well, I can read Plato, and I picked up the old book again and started reading it. I started reading it with my friend Rich, and we walked through one of the harder dialogues. It helped me to prepare my ancient philosophy class with Jeremy Swingle. How this one thing, the Lord is just doing wonderful things through this one mundane purchase. If you want to have good answers, friends, you've got to be able to look at your life and see the hand of God working in it. So what's the point? There is a way to answer every question and to articulate your reality right now as something close to heaven, something close to eternity, and you need to get better at doing that. 1 Peter 3:15 says, be ready always. Not to wear your passing emotions on your sleeve, all of your angers. Be ready always to make a defense to everyone. That's an apologia, an explanation, a reasoned explanation to everyone who asks you to give an account of the hope that is in you, but with gentleness and reverence. How many of you, if you're honest, you'd say, I, in fact, am ready always to share my biggest griefs, frustrations about the government. I'm ready at the drop of a hat. We're never called to that. Paul puts it this way: whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good repute, if there is any excellence and if anything worthy of praise, dwell on these things. That's what we're going to do in heaven. Start doing it now. And then Paul says, I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am in. And he can do that because his heart is already in heaven. Are you like the modern Marxist? If you answer honestly, I have learned the secret of being discontent in whatever circumstances. I have learned the secret of finding whatever's wrong. It comes out in my every answer. I just have a warning for you, friends. If you don't really have gospel hope, but mutter lifeless confidence, you take this sermon, it's like, well, I've got to be happy in my answers. But you don't engage the perspective of your victory at all, your answers will be worse than lifeless. They will burden people. Forced joy that doesn't come from real reflection on the promises of the gospel is painful. So we must be students of our salvation, engaging it, ready to speak first and foremost for it. I would say if you're an unbeliever, you're with us today, do you have any hope to share whatsoever in light of current circumstances in the world, frustrations with the government, maybe half of the population? Do you have any hope at all? You will never have hope but in Jesus Christ, who can take you to the other side where eternity has begun. Receive and rest upon him alone for salvation, we beg you. Believer, do your answers contain little heavenly perspective as if you have no secret? Are you rarely ready to give an account of the hope that is in you? I just need to remind you, you are justified by grace alone, through faith alone. And that means your citizenship is in heaven. You belong to another age and another time where victory is the only reality. You're justified by grace alone, through faith alone, but frankly, to keep that refreshing truth before your mind and to enjoy its present fruits, that requires attention and meditation, and I hope that's why you're here. Let's bow our heads. Mighty God, I pray that we would be more faithful at answering questions well, because we are people who really believe we have a secret that trumps every burden, that trumps every passing care. Lord, a perspective that gives life and edifies because it bears testimony to you, the giver of life. May we be a people who, by the very way we answer, we go out into the world and we're noticeably different. That we have something that a world that is angry and frustrated and terrified doesn't have. Lord, make us your disciples. Make us lights in a world, a wicked and perverse generation. We pray these things, Father, in the name of your Son, Jesus, and by your Spirit. Amen.